There are moments in life when we believe we know exactly who deserves our trust and who does not. We build walls around our hearts based on what we see, what we assume, what society has taught us to fear. But what happens when the person we judged as unworthy becomes the one who teaches us the most profound lesson about integrity? What if the hands we pulled away from in disgust are the very ones that hold our salvation? The rain was falling that afternoon, not gently, but with a violence that seemed to cleanse the city of its sins, washing away the grime from marble steps and designer storefronts alike. She stood there, frozen beneath the awning of an exclusive boutique, her designer coat pulled tight against the cold, her fingers trembling as they searched through her purse with increasing desperation. The wallet was gone. Not just any wallet, but the one containing her identification, her credit cards, the keys to her gated community, and worse, documents she needed for a meeting that could change her professional life. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as the realization settled over her like ice water. Across the street, barely visible through the sheets of rain, a figure sat huddled against a building, wrapped in layers of tattered fabric, a cardboard sign propped against weathered knees. In that moment of panic and fear, her eyes locked onto him, and something ancient and ugly rose within her chest, something she would have denied possessing if asked just hours before. Without evidence, without reason, without even a shred of proof, she knew with absolute certainty where her wallet had gone. She knew because she had been taught to know, trained by a lifetime of whispered warnings and carefully constructed barriers between her world and his. The assumption came as naturally as breathing. The poor take from the rich. The desperate steal from the secure. The homeless are thieves. These weren't thoughts she would have spoken aloud at her country club luncheons or charity galas, but they lived within her nonetheless, dormant until moments like this gave them permission to surface. She marched across that rain-soaked street with righteous fury burning in her chest, her expensive heels clicking against wet pavement like a judge's gavel, ready to deliver her verdict before any trial had begun. She stood over him, this man whose face she hadn't even bothered to see clearly, and in a voice that carried all the authority her privilege had granted her, she accused him. The words came out sharp and certain, demanding he return what he had stolen, threatening police involvement, making a scene that drew the attention of passers-by who clutched their own belongings a little tighter. He looked up at her then, and for just a moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her falter, something that whispered she might be making a terrible mistake. But pride is a powerful drug, and she had already committed to her narrative. He said nothing. He simply shook his head slowly, his weathered hands open and empty before her, and in that gesture of quiet dignity, he somehow made her feel smaller than she had ever felt in her expensive clothes and educated arrogance. She walked away, still convinced of her righteousness, still certain that his silence was admission of guilt, still believing that the universe operated according to the rules she had been taught. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to human judgment, washing everything clean without discrimination. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling something stir in your chest, something that asks you to examine your own assumptions about people, about worth, about who deserves our respect, then please, subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if you believe that every person carries within them the capacity to surprise us, to teach us, to show us who we really are when we strip away all our comfortable certainties. And I want to hear from you, from wherever you are in this world. Comment below and tell me what country you're watching from, because these questions, these moments of moral reckoning, they belong to all of us, regardless of where we call home. The hours that followed her accusation were filled with phone calls and bureaucracy, the tedious process of canceling cards and reporting losses, the inconvenience that felt like punishment from an unjust universe. She sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by furnishings that cost more than most people earned in a year, and nursed her anger like a flame she refused to let die. In her mind, she had been victimized, robbed not just of her possessions but of her time, her peace of mind, her sense of security in a world that was supposed to recognize and respect people like her. The evening came slowly, the rain finally easing into a soft drizzle that painted her windows with tears. She had just poured herself a glass of wine, expensive and imported, when the doorbell rang. She approached the door with irritation, expecting a delivery or perhaps a neighbor with some trivial complaint. What she found instead would fracture every assumption she had built her day upon. He stood there on her doorstep, this man she had accused hours before in the rain, this homeless stranger who had no business knowing where she lived or having any reason to seek her out. Her first instinct was fear, then anger, her hand already reaching for her phone to call the police, ready to add trespassing to the list of crimes she had invented for him. But then she saw what he held in his hands, extended toward her like an offering, like a piece of evidence in a trial where she was suddenly uncertain which role she played. Her wallet. Intact, untouched, every card and document exactly where she had left them. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis in that moment, reality rearranging itself into a shape she hadn't anticipated. Her mouth opened but no words came, her practiced speeches of accusation suddenly useless, her certainty crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. He spoke then, his voice rougher than she expected but carrying a gentleness that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't immediately name. He had found it, he explained, not stolen it but discovered it lying on a bench where she must have set it down while adjusting her bags earlier that afternoon. He had recognized her immediately when she had confronted him in the rain, had known she was accusing him of taking something he had actually been protecting. But instead of defending himself in that moment, instead of displaying the anger any innocent person had the right to feel, he had chosen silence. He had chosen to let her believe what she needed to believe, to let her walk away with her assumptions intact, and then he had taken the time, the considerable effort required of someone with no resources and no reason to help her, to find out where she lived. She stood there holding her wallet, this object that had seemed so precious hours before and now felt heavy with shame, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. Her training kicked in, the social scripts that governed interactions between her world and his, and she reached for her purse, pulling out bills with shaking hands, trying to translate her gratitude and her apology into the only language she thought he would understand. Money. Compensation. The transaction that would let her feel better about her mistake without requiring her to actually change anything fundamental about how she saw the world. He looked at the money she offered, looked at it for a long moment as if considering something far more complex than whether to accept or refuse, and then he did something that would haunt her far more than any theft could have. He stepped back, his hands remaining at his sides, and he spoke words that cut through every defense she had constructed around her heart. He told her that he didn't want her money. That the satisfaction of doing what was right, of acting with honor when no one would have known if he had chosen differently, that was worth more than any reward she could offer. He told her that gratitude, real gratitude, wasn't about paying someone off to ease your conscience. It was about recognizing that character has nothing to do with bank accounts, that integrity doesn't require a permanent address, that the content of a person's heart can't be measured by the clothes they wear or the circumstances they endure. He told her these things not with anger or bitterness, not with the vindictive satisfaction of someone turning the tables on their accuser, but with a quiet dignity that made every word land like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward to touch everything she thought she knew about herself. She stood in her doorway, this woman who had always believed herself to be good, charitable even, the type who donated to approved causes and felt warmly benevolent toward those less fortunate, and she felt the foundations of her self-perception crack. Because in that moment, facing this man she had wronged, she understood that all her charity had been conditional, filtered through layers of judgment and control, given from a position of superiority rather than solidarity. She had never actually seen homeless people as fully human, not really, not in the way that mattered. They had been props in her narrative of goodness, recipients of her generosity when she chose to bestow it, but never equals, never individuals with their own honor and pride and moral codes that might surpass her own. The rain had stopped completely now, and in the silence that followed his refusal of her money, she could hear the sound of water dripping from eaves, the distant rumble of traffic, the small sounds of the world continuing despite her personal apocalypse. He turned to leave, his mission completed, his conscience clear, and she found her voice finally breaking free from the paralysis of shock. She called after him, her voice smaller than she had ever heard it, stripped of authority and pretense, just the raw sound of a human being confronting their own capacity for cruelty. She asked him to wait, asked if she could do anything, offer anything, make amends in some way that didn't insult them both with the simplicity of cash exchange. He paused, turned back to look at her with eyes that held no malice despite having every right to anger, and he gave her a gift more valuable than the return of her wallet. He told her that what she could do, the only thing that mattered, was to remember this moment the next time she looked at someone society had taught her to dismiss. To remember that circumstances don't define character, that poverty isn't a moral failing, that the absence of material wealth doesn't mean the absence of everything that makes us human and worthy of respect. He told her that if she really wanted to thank him, she could carry this lesson forward, let it change how she moved through the world, let it crack open the comfortable certainties that allowed people like her to sleep peacefully while people like him slept on cardboard in the rain. Then he walked away, disappearing into the evening shadows, leaving her standing in the doorway of her expensive house, holding her recovered wallet, and feeling more lost than she had ever felt when she thought it was gone. The days that followed were strange and uncomfortable, marked by a restlessness she couldn't shake. She went through her routines, attended her meetings, smiled at the right moments and said the expected things, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life. She found herself noticing things she had trained herself not to see. The people sleeping in doorways, the ones holding signs at intersections, the invisible population that moved through her city like ghosts, visible only when they became convenient villains in stories like the one she had created. She began to understand that her accusation that rainy afternoon hadn't been an isolated mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by panic and circumstance. It had been the natural expression of beliefs she carried within her, beliefs she had inherited from her parents, her community, her entire social ecosystem. Beliefs that told her she was inherently more valuable than people who had less, that her comfort and convenience mattered more than their dignity, that her assumptions about them were more reliable than any actual knowledge of who they were. These beliefs hadn't made her a monster. That was almost the worst part. They had allowed her to remain comfortable, kind even, in her own estimation. She had never actively wished harm on anyone. She had simply accepted a hierarchy that placed her near the top and others far below, and she had lived within that structure without questioning its foundations. She started driving different routes, intentionally passing through areas she had previously avoided, forcing herself to see what she had been taught to ignore. She saw families living in vehicles, elderly people pushing shopping carts filled with their entire lives, young people with old eyes sitting on street corners. And she began to understand that each one carried a story more complex than she had ever bothered to imagine, that homelessness wasn't a single condition but 1,000 different paths that led to the same destination of invisibility and judgment. She thought often about the man who had returned her wallet, wondering where he was, whether he was safe, whether he knew the magnitude of what he had done not just in returning her possessions but in holding up a mirror to her soul. She wanted to find him, to try again to express what she had failed to articulate that evening, but she had no idea where to look, and part of her suspected that the lesson required her to sit with the discomfort rather than finding easy absolution. She told the story to her friends, testing it out in different contexts, watching their reactions. Some laughed nervously and changed the subject, uncomfortable with implications that reached too close to their own assumptions. Others nodded sympathetically but in a way that suggested they believed she had simply encountered an exceptional homeless person, an outlier who proved the rule rather than challenged it. But a few, a precious few, understood what she was really saying, what she was really asking. They understood that she was describing a moment of awakening that was both gift and burden, the kind of knowledge that once gained can never be unknown. Her perspective on charity changed dramatically. She could no longer write checks to homeless services with the same sense of benevolent satisfaction. Those donations had been about making herself feel better, about maintaining the system that created homelessness while offering just enough help to ease her conscience. Real change, she began to understand, would require more than money. It would require her to examine and dismantle the structures of prejudice and indifference that she had participated in her entire life. It would require her to see homeless people not as a problem to be solved from a comfortable distance but as human beings worthy of the same respect and dignity she expected for herself. She started volunteering, not at fancy fundraising galas but at actual shelters and food banks, places where she had to interact directly with the people she had previously categorized and dismissed. It was harder than she expected, not because they were difficult or dangerous as she had been taught to fear, but because every interaction reminded her of how wrong she had been, how much humanity she had denied in service of her own comfort. She heard stories that shattered her assumptions. Military veterans who had served their country and been abandoned by it. People with advanced degrees who had lost everything to medical bills or divorce or simply bad luck. Families who had been one paycheck away from stability when the economy shifted beneath their feet. People with mental illness or addiction, yes, but she began to understand these as health conditions rather than moral failings, began to see how society's response to these conditions often pushed people further into crisis rather than toward healing. She learned names, listened to dreams, discovered that being homeless didn't erase hope or humor or the desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. She met poets and musicians, skilled tradespeople and former business owners, people who had simply hit a stretch of catastrophically bad luck in a system that offered no safety net and no second chances. And she understood, finally, that the only difference between them and her was circumstance and support, not character or worth. The lesson the man had taught her kept expanding, revealing new layers the deeper she went. It wasn't just about homelessness or poverty. It was about how she made judgments about people based on appearance, how she assumed she knew someone's story from a glance, how she had granted herself permission to feel superior based on accidents of birth and privilege she had done nothing to earn. She began to notice it everywhere, this pattern of assumption and dismissal. The way she treated service workers, speaking to them as if they were less intelligent or important. The way she made snap judgments about people based on their clothes, their accent, their neighborhood. The way she moved through the world with an unconscious sense that some people mattered more than others, that some lives held more value, that some struggles deserved sympathy while others deserved judgment. Confronting these patterns in herself was painful. It would have been easier to tell herself that returning the wallet had made them even, that his lesson had been learned and she could move on with minor adjustments to her behavior. But honesty, real honesty, required her to sit with the shame of recognizing how many people she had dismissed or devalued over the course of her life, how many opportunities for connection and learning she had missed because she had been taught to see certain people as less than fully human. She thought about privilege differently now, not as something to feel guilty about but as something that carried responsibility. She had been given advantages not because she deserved them but because of systems and structures that predated her. The question wasn't whether she had earned her position but what she would do with it now that she understood how arbitrary and unjust its foundations were. Could she use her privilege to challenge the systems that created and maintained inequality? Could she leverage her position to amplify voices that were usually silenced? Could she learn to act in solidarity rather than charity, as an ally rather than a savior? These questions haunted her in the best way, pushing her toward a kind of engagement with the world that was far more demanding and far more meaningful than the comfortable distance she had maintained before. Months passed, seasons changed, and she continued her transformation, though she understood it would be a lifelong process rather than a destination she could reach and declare complete. She made mistakes, said the wrong things, struggled with the discomfort of unlearning patterns that had been ingrained since childhood. But she kept showing up, kept listening, kept trying to see people as they actually were rather than through the distorting lens of prejudice and assumption. She never saw the man again, the one who had taught her the most important lesson of her life. She looked for him, asked about him in the places where homeless people gathered, described him to outreach workers and shelter staff. Some people thought they might know who she meant, but no one could say for certain where he was or whether he was all right. His absence became part of the lesson somehow, teaching her that transformation wasn't about finding closure or redemption through a perfect ending. It was about carrying forward the knowledge he had given her, honoring his dignity and his choice by letting it change how she lived every day. She understood now that he had taught her about gratitude, real gratitude, the kind that goes beyond transaction and enters the realm of transformation. She was grateful not just for the return of her wallet but for the shattering of her comfortable delusions. Grateful for the discomfort that pushed her toward growth. Grateful for the reminder that honor and integrity have nothing to do with bank accounts or addresses. Grateful for the chance to become a better version of herself, even though that process was painful and ongoing and would probably never feel complete. One rainy afternoon, almost a year after that first encounter, she found herself standing beneath an awning again, watching the water fall from gray skies, and she thought about how much had changed. She still lived in the same house, still had many of the same material comforts, but the person inside those circumstances was fundamentally different. She saw the world through new eyes now, eyes that had been opened by a homeless man who had every reason to be angry at her and chose dignity instead. Eyes that could no longer unsee the humanity in people she had been taught to ignore. As she stood there, someone approached, a young woman who clearly had nowhere else to shelter from the rain, and the old her would have pulled away, clutched her purse tighter, created distance. But the new her, the one still learning and growing, made space under the awning, offered a smile that acknowledged their shared humanity rather than the differences between them. The young woman looked surprised, then grateful, and they stood together in comfortable silence, two people taking shelter from the same storm. It was a small moment, unremarkable in many ways, but it felt like evidence that the lesson had taken root. That she was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to move through the world differently. That the man's gift was still bearing fruit in ways he would never know. She thought about honor and what it means to act with integrity when no one would know if you chose differently. She thought about how the man could have kept her wallet, could have used her cards before she canceled them, could have sold her identity or simply thrown everything away out of justified anger at being falsely accused. But he had chosen to do what was right anyway, not because anyone was watching, not because he expected reward, but because that's who he was when stripped of everything except character. That was the definition of honor she tried to carry with her now, the standard she tried to meet in her own choices, though she understood she was still learning. She thought about the ways society measures worth and success, the metrics of achievement and accumulation that had governed her life before that rainy afternoon. She had believed that having more meant being more, that her possessions and position proved her value. But the man who owned almost nothing had possessed something she was only beginning to understand the value of, a clear sense of self that didn't depend on external validation or material measures. He knew who he was and what he stood for, and that knowledge couldn't be taken away by circumstance or hardship. That was wealth of a different order, the kind that sustained you through storms rather than the kind that melted away when tested. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, and she realized that was what the encounter had done for her. It had washed away the comfortable lies she had told herself about who she was and what she believed. It had cleansed her of certainties that had prevented her from truly seeing. It had stripped away layers of protection that had kept her safe from uncomfortable truths. And while the process had been painful, while she still struggled with the weight of what she had learned about herself, she wouldn't trade that knowledge for anything. Because ignorance, she understood now, wasn't bliss. It was a kind of death, a way of moving through the world half awake, half alive, never fully present to the complexity and beauty and struggle of human existence. The man had given her the gift of awareness, and with it, the responsibility to do better, be better, see better. As the rain began to ease and people emerged from their shelters to continue their journeys, she thought about gratitude again and what it truly means. Not a transaction or an exchange, not something you could purchase or perform. True gratitude was a way of being, a recognition that we are all connected, all dependent on each other's kindness and humanity to make this world livable. The man had understood that when he chose to return her wallet. She was still learning it, still practicing the art of living gratefully in a world that tried to teach her to hoard and protect and separate. Still trying to honor his lesson by becoming someone worthy of the gift he had given. The story didn't have a neat ending because real transformation never does. She continued her work, her learning, her stumbling attempts to dismantle her own prejudices and see people clearly. She made mistakes and tried again. She listened more and spoke less. She showed up and kept showing up even when it was uncomfortable. And somewhere in the city, perhaps sheltered from the rain or perhaps not, a man who had taught her everything about honor lived his life, carrying his own struggles and his own dignity, unaware that his simple act of returning a wallet had set someone else on a path toward becoming more fully human. That's how grace works sometimes. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through small acts of integrity that ripple outward in ways we can never fully measure or control. He had been honorable because that's who he was. And she was learning to be grateful, truly grateful, for the mirror he had held up to her soul.